Thank you very much. Very grateful to be here. Given the limited amount of time, I'm going to try to communicate very briefly and mostly look at some data. Okay, the rate of capital accumulation, new investment as a percentage of capital, has declined in the United States and in Europe over the last 3 decades. And this decline is among the underlying long-term causes of the latest economic crisis. The most obvious and on the face of things, the most plausible explanation of that decline in rate of accumulation of profit is that the rate of profit itself has declined. Thus, profit is being plowed back into new investment because the rate of profit has declined. But Michel Besson, Gerald Dominio, Kostas Lavavitsis, and some other radical economists reject this rather obvious explanation. They instead claim the rate of profit has risen since the early 1980s. But nonetheless, they say the rate of accumulation has fallen. Why? Because the so-called neoliberal phase of capitalism has a distinctive regime of accumulation that favors diversion of profits away from productive investment and into financial speculation. What I'm going to do is to look at official U.S. government data for U.S. corporations and basically to say these claims are false. But before getting into the data, I just want to talk about the political implications of this controversy. They're profound. If neoliberal policies and increased exploitation have led to a substantial recovery in profitability, then fall in profitability is not among the underlying causes of capitalism's latest crisis, and therefore the crisis is an irreducibly financial one. I mean, it's a financial crisis, but what lies behind? Well, if it's not a fall in the rate of profit, it's just irreducibly financial, caused by the financialization of capitalism and macroeconomic difficulties resulting from it, as well as things like derivatives and other short-term financial sector phenomena. Now, this thesis then implies that we can prevent the recurrence of such financial crises by doing away with neoliberalism and financialized capitalism. It's unnecessary to do away with the capitalist system of value production. This view also implies that what the crisis has put on the agenda is the need for things like financial regulation, Keynesian policies, perhaps nationalization of banks, but not a change in the character of the socioeconomic system. If, on the other hand, the crisis is a systemic crisis resulting from an underlying tendency of falling profitability, then such reforms will at best only delay the next crisis. Moreover, the immense buildup of government debt we're seeing may delay the day of reckoning by providing temporary and artificial stimulus to the economy, but the debt buildup promises to make the next crisis worse when it comes. So my way of thinking here is very similar to that of, I think, the late Chris Harman in the book Zombie Capitalism and elsewhere. I'm going to be focusing on U.S. data both because they're the most complete, but also the U.S. is the epicenter of the crisis. The crisis erupted elsewhere because it first erupted in the U.S. and spread. So even though I'm not discussing other economies and it's not an adequate discussion of the world economy over the last several decades, I think it does suffice to talk about why the crisis erupted and what's underlying the crisis in the United States that then spread. Okay, I'm going to begin by just taking for granted, because of lack of time, that there has been relative economic stagnation since the mid-1970s. No continuation of the boom, no real rebound after the crisis of the mid-70s. Okay. And the most obvious, and looking at the projector up here, most obvious in the face of things, the most plausible explanation of this relative stagnation is that the rate of profit failed to rebound significantly after the early 1980s. The persistent fall in the rate of profit produces the persistent fall in the rate of capital accumulation, and then the fall in the rate of accumulation led to sluggish growth, rising debt burdens, and so forth. Evidence for the United States suggests that this is in fact correct. The third point is not controversial, really, so I'm going to limit myself to discussion of the first 2 points. Figure 1 presents movements in corporations' rate of profit. There's a broad measure of profit, which I'm calling property income, looked at here. It's the share of corporations' net value added that their employees don't receive. So it's everything except what the employees receive, and so therefore a proxy for what Karl Marx meant by surplus value. So this rate of profit has continued to fall, since the early 1980s, really more or less an unbroken fall throughout the whole post-World War period. Now, this measurement of the rate of profit in terms of the historical cost of the assets is often criticized because it is affected by inflation, but I produced inflation adjustments and 2 different ways of adjusting for inflation. The conclusion is not altered. There was no rebound in the rate of profit after the crisis of the early 80s. The next slide indicates that my second point, that's obvious and plausible, is in fact correct. The persistent fall in profitability led to a persistent fall in the rate of accumulation. So the red is the rate of profit, the blue is the rate of accumulation, or investment as a percentage of the capital. Very, very tight relationship here. Yet we have people saying that the rate of accumulation has basically become disconnected from the rate of profit. And they say that's due to financialization. I think there's really no basis for that when I look at these numbers. Okay. So despite this evidence, the radical economists who contend that the rate of profit has recovered, they don't accept the evidence for the rate of profit falling that I presented here. They're proponents of the so-called current cost or replacement cost rate of profit, which is profit as a percentage of the amount of money that businesses currently need to replace their capital assets. That's what those people mean by rate of profit. What almost everybody else means by rate of profit, businesses, investors, Marx, myself, they mean profit as a percentage of the money that was actually invested in the past to purchase the capital assets, machines, buildings, and so forth, minus any depreciation. And movements in these 2 different rates of profit, 2 different concepts of rate of profit, they've differed substantially since the early 1980s. So the historical cost rate of profit did continue to decline, as we saw, but here you've got the current cost rate. And that low point is not coming out clearly here. That's about 80 to 82, and there's been somewhat of a rebound since then. Okay, but this leaves the people who say it's only a financial crisis or a reducibly financial crisis with a serious problem. Because they deny that the rate of profit fell, they must deny that the fall in the rate of accumulation is caused by a fall in the rate of profit. They then have to account for the extremely curious fact that the rate of accumulation failed to rebound in response to recovery in what they call the rate of profit. Very peculiar. There's profit there, but somehow it's not being invested. Very peculiar. Now, the most obvious and, on the face of it, the most plausible way to account for this curious fact is that what they call the rate of profit is just a figment of a physicalist imagination. I don't have time to go into all of it here. I have elsewhere, but it's not what businesses and investors seek to maximize. It doesn't matter to measure their actual rates of return. Their expected future rates of return. There's no clear relationship to the actual rate of capital accumulation, and it does not adjust for inflation properly. They say you need to look at it in order to adjust for inflation, but what it adjusts for is changes in the price of each particular capital asset, not the general economy-wide price level, the way a proper inflation adjustment does. So it's just not surprising that the rate of accumulation goes down when their rate of profit goes up, because their rate of profit really doesn't matter to anything. But instead of accepting that, these folks imagined that a distinct neoliberal regime of accumulation emerged in the early 1980s, and so they say the rate of accumulation fell, not because of a lack of profit, but because the new regime of accumulation was one in which profits were diverted away from productive investment and into financial markets, purchases of financial instruments, gambling, all kinds of things in the markets. So this is why they say it's basically a financial style crisis, not a profitability crisis. But it's not true. At least it's not true with the United States. We saw in the previous slide the rate of accumulation comes down, closely tracking the fall in the rate of profit. And here's my last slide. This is net investment as a percentage of after-tax profits. The proportion stuff at the right is 1987 through 01. Stuff at the left is 1947 to 79. The latter period, the proportion of after-tax profits that were productively invested was a bit higher than in the previous part, the early part of the post-war period. So there is just not, in the United States, this neoliberal diversion of profits into financial instruments away from productive investment. It hasn't occurred. Now, if you start from about 1980, which is that peak, and then you look since 1980, well, yeah, you've got a big fall. And that's what Michelle Son does in a recent critique of my empirical work. But that figure right at the top there, that 1980, that was an unsustainably high level, and that's because profitability was so low. There was a huge drop in profitability, and they continued to invest for a while. So for about 6 years, from 1980 through 86, net investment was more than 100% of after-tax profits. Corporations were investing more after-tax profits than they actually had. The opposite can't do that forever. So the thing came down. But it's not an indication of any widening of the gap, any long-term change from productive investment into portfolio investment. I hope to explore this more, but I think my time's up.
Alfredo Saad Filho, who teaches development studies at Swords University in London.
Thank you very much. It's a real privilege to speak at Marxism 2010. What I'm going to try and argue today is slightly different from Andrew's point, perhaps, that we're going through a systemic crisis in global neoliberalism, but this is not a crisis of neoliberalism, because although the reproduction of the system of accumulation has been destabilized, neoliberalism is not necessarily in a chronic state of crisis, and it certainly is not in any immediate danger of collapse. Now, first of all, quick word about the kind of approach that I'm using. The tendency to crisis, we know it's inherent in capitalism, but the determinants of any specific crisis are always historically specific, and they are embedded in the modalities of accumulation of particular times and places. So in this sense, I think there is no disembodied crisis theory in Marx, and the analysis of specific crises presupposes the study of concrete configurations of the capital relation. I think this is one of the reasons why Marx spent a lot of time looking at the movement of capital during his own lifetime, rather than trying to elaborate a general theory of crisis, which, as we know, he never did. So, in this kind of vein, in my work, I have tried to argue that neoliberalism, as the current mode of existence of capitalism, emerged between the mid-1970s and the early 1990s in response to the transformation of the conditions of global accumulation that accompanied the disarticulation of the Keynesian social democratic consensus in the rich countries, the growing paralysis of developmentalism in the poor countries, and the implosion of the Soviet bloc. Now, very briefly, neoliberalism is based on the systematic use of state power to impose a hegemonic project of recomposition of the rule of capital at 5 levels: domestic resource allocation, international economic integration, the reproduction of the state, ideology, and social reproduction. Now, very briefly, the first defining feature of neoliberalism is the introduction of a new modality of resource allocation. State capacity to influence the balance between investment and consumption, the composition of output and investment, the articulation of production across borders. They have been systematically transferred to an increasingly integrated global financial sector led by US institutions. And this has given the financial system a critical degree of influence on the level and composition of investment, output and employment, the structure of demand, the financing of the state, and the patterns of international specialization. In the age of neoliberalism, finance controls the main sources of capital and the levers of economic policy in those countries. And inevitably, this has also facilitated the expansion of a globally integrated sphere of speculative transactions. Financialization of accumulation is not a distortion of capitalism, it's not a coup against productive capital. And the constitutive role of finance in the capital relation in the age of neoliberalism has allowed finance to appropriate an increasing share of the surplus value extracted by the non-financial corporate sector. Second defining feature of neoliberalism is the transnationalization of individual circuits of capital accumulation. And this has recomposed the pre-existing systems of provision at a higher level of productivity. It has reshaped the mode of integration of the world economy. It has facilitated the introduction of new technologies and labor processes, while at the same time compressing real wages and raising the rate of surplus value. Transnationalization also implies that the current crisis has to be understood systemically as well as globally. The third defining aspect of neoliberalism is the financialization of the state and of ideology, because the state is the agent that transfers to finance control over the sources of capital, that sets up the new industrial and financial structure, that manages the legal and regulatory changes supporting neoliberalism. It is a state that legitimizes the systemic transition and, importantly, that represses the opposition. Fourth, financialization has imposed social discipline in three specific ways. First of all, through the expansion of capitalism during the last 30 years and the incorporation of hundreds of millions of new workers into transnational circuits of accumulation, which has created new centers of accumulation that are now the most dynamic regions of the global economy. The restructuring of production and then the legal, regulatory, and political changes that follow them have transformed the patterns of employment. They have increased competition between and within working classes in different countries, and they have narrowed down the scope for resistance against neoliberalism. Social discipline was also enforced by the state through restrictive welfare policies and contractionary monetary and fiscal policies under the continuing threat of financial crises, exchange rate crises, or balance of payments crises. And social discipline has been imposed by the financialization of the reproduction of the working class, especially in the US and the UK. And this is distinctive about these two countries, because with the disarticulation of the old patterns of employment, the stagnation of wages, and the retreat of the welfare state, many workers were drawn into systematic borrowing and saving and became dependent on asset inflation to meet their reproduction needs. At the same time, personal credit was also a very important macroeconomic policy tool, and manipulation of personal credit has been assimilated by some colleagues from asset price Keynesianism, because to some extent private deficits replaced the role of public sector deficits in macroeconomic stabilization. So the significance of financialization for capitalism today does not hinge on whether or not it is associated with higher GDP growth rates or whatever, but on the fact that financialization supports the transnationalization of production, facilitates the concentration of income and wealth, and sustains the hegemony of neoliberalism through continuing threats of fiscal crises and capital flight. It is then not surprising that the transition to neoliberalism has been associated with rising rates of exploitation, the decline of the wage share of national income in most countries, and the recovery of global accumulation after the crises of the 70s and early 80s. The crisis we have now then is due to a combination of factors, starting from the limitations of financialization as a driver has tended to take the form of bubbles, which eventually collapse with destructive implications and invariably requiring a state-sponsored bailout. He also were perverse changes in labor market structure that I mentioned before, regressive shifts in the provision of means of subsistence, and limited macroeconomic policy tools, all of them disguised by ideological claims about competition and individual choice. And these contradictions indicate that this is a systemic crisis in neoliberalism, although it is not a crisis of neoliberalism, because although the reproduction of the system of accumulation has been deeply shaken, it is not being threatened by a systemic alternative, which is of course a political issue, given that capitalism will not collapse spontaneously. Now, conversely, the crisis is not primarily due to simple disproportions or overproduction, underconsumption, or falling profitability, although it may include elements of each. Evidence suggests that profit rates rose after the neoliberal transition in many rich and poor countries, and clearly there has been no 40-year-long stagnation in global capitalism, as has been demonstrated in the literature, as you can verify also by looking at our mobile phones, computers, or by looking at the 2 or 3 dozen emerging global metropolitan areas between Tokyo and Sao Paulo, where we find a highly dynamic picture of uneven and combined development under capitalism, but also we find the main centers of resistance today. So global capitalism has not just managed to scrape a living during the last 30 or 40 years, it has prospered enormously, it has transformed the world, and in doing this it has also demolished most mass organizations of the left. With due respect, this is a picture of strength. It is uneven, it is unstable, it is crisis-prone, but it is strength. And the boom years between 1983 and 1990, between 1992 and 2000, and between 2001 and 2007 were real enough. Now, between these booms, we had cyclical crises, often bubble-like, as I said, and now we're going through a structural crisis in neoliberal capitalism, but this is not a repeat, and much less a continuation of the crisis of the 1970s. So to make it completely clear, in my view, what we have today is a new crisis. It is a systemic crisis in the neoliberal system of accumulation. But this is not a crisis of capitalism as a mode of production. It is not even a terminal crisis of neoliberalism, unless there is mass opposition to the restoration of neoliberalism that is being attempted now. So, 3 conclusions. First, from the point of view of capital, the resolution of crises of profitability requires reversing workers' gains and introducing technological innovations to cut costs. But this is not the case today because the crisis has not been caused by rising wages, by underinvestment, or by the failure to scrap old machines. But if the crisis is associated with financial speculation, with excess capacity, and with global macroeconomic imbalances, then its resolution for capital requires state support to finance and to consumption, low interest rates, and rebalancing the world economy. And this starts to resemble the problems and the policies of capitalism in this world. Second, the strategies of management of the crisis demonstrate the depth and the extent of the hegemony of neoliberalism over ideology and state policy. Large states have spent incalculable sums supporting finance with no serious demand for restructuring, and these policies have enjoyed broad political support. Third, the ongoing macroeconomic adjustments have been limited by conflicting pressures on the US dollar, by China's exchange controls, by contradictions in the Eurozone, by political deadlocks, and by the extraordinarily inflexible apparatus put in place earlier to lock in low inflation. Now, these are serious limitations, but neoliberalism has got the resources to address these problems gradually and very, very imperfectly, as long as the global working class remains quiescent. So to finish, I have argued that neoliberalism is only secondarily an ideology or a set of economic policies. It is primarily a material form of social reproduction and social rule. It is a totality that encompasses the structure of accumulation, international exchanges, the state, ideology, and the reproduction of the working class. And this totality has been destabilized but not fundamentally threatened by the crisis, which allows the neoliberal consensus to try and restore the status quo ante as much as possible. In contrast, the destabilization of neoliberalism, I'll finish here, is a project of the radical left. Although the neoliberal consensus leaves only a very narrow space for alliances at the top, the scope for alliances against neoliberalism at the bottom of the world's society is potentially unlimited. The message then is one of confrontation. Thank you very much.
Okay, the next speaker is Choonara, who is the author of Unraveling Capitalism and also a member of the Social Party.
I want to start from what Andrew said, because if we take Andrew's comment seriously, it has very, very profound implications for not simply at the level of theory, but in terms of what we do and what our strategy is going ahead. Because I agree, and I'm convinced that what we're seeing at the moment is not simply a banking crisis or a financial crisis or a crisis of neoliberalism, but what we're seeing at the moment is a systemic crisis of capitalism. And that, I think, has to be our starting point. Only through that context can we understand other features of this crisis. First of all, the extent to which all of the choices facing our ruling class at the moment are bad choices. And secondly, the speed and severity with which the crisis has spread throughout the system. I remember reading the Financial Times when the subprime crisis first broke in America. And there's a very interesting column that said there's a problem in subprime, but it will be limited to subprime. And the great thing about modern capitalism is, as to quote them, securitization is doing what it was always supposed to do, spread the risk. Absolutely right, it spread the risk. It brought down a large chunk of the financial system and then created the worst crisis since the 1930s. But we have to understand the wider context to understand why the progress of the crisis took this form. I agree with Andrew that what we're seeing at the moment is rooted in a long-term crisis of profitability that began in the 1970s. I'm not going to repeat what he said about that. But I think it's also important to understand something else Marx said, which is what are the kind of processes within capitalism that can solve the crisis of profitability? And here we have to look back to previous crises and show what it took to actually get the system out of the hole that it got itself into. In the 1930s, what it took was essentially the destruction of a large chunk of the system, the collapse of large chunks of it, the rapid depreciation of capital, the selling off of unprofitable firms, the dumping of goods on the market, and also, fundamentally, the political restructuring of capitalism in the run-up to the Second World War. States stepped in, rebuilt the productive apparatuses, preparing the way for war. When the war finished, handed this all back to the private sector, providing a massive boost to the profitability of capitalism and paving the way for the long boom that followed in the 50s and 60s. The long boom was what ended in the 1970s, but I think we have to understand something else that had changed in the structure of capitalism. By the time that crisis returned in a big way in the 70s, something that Chris Harman used to like to say was that the face of capitalism had changed and the units of capital had become bigger, the size of corporations were much bigger, more intertwined and more embedded and wrapped up with the state. When crisis returned to the system, it returned to a very different system. And from this point onwards, and it's a tendency that develops through the post-war period, when crisis erupted, states were terrified that the failure of a few giant firms could bring the whole system crashing down. And that's why the period since the Second World War has been a period of state intervention to resolve crisis and a period of the doctrine of too big to fail. And this meant that when the crisis returned, it could not fully take hold and fully resolve the underlying problems of the system faced. The world has remained, I'm not saying the profit rates have continued to fall, or that they haven't gone up and down, but the overall picture we've seen for the last 30 years has been a picture of low profitability. Many Marxists now empirically accept that, although there are quite significant arguments about the causes of it. But not only is this accepted by Marxists, occasionally it impinges upon the mainstream. So a column in the Financial Times recently lamented the fact that the return on capital had fallen in the US from 15% in the post-war period down to 10% in the 1980s and down to just 5% today. Hardly a brilliant advert for the dynamism of capitalism, once heralded by the likes of Gordon Brown and echoed in the financial pages. What we have to say strategically, until this underlying crisis of profitability is resolved, any recovery is likely to be weak, and it's likely to pave the way for future subsequent crises. Our understanding of the nature of the system has strategic implications. The second way in which the system has changed also has implications. Because of the low rate of profitability, from the 1970s onwards, what we saw was more and more value, more and more surplus value being channeled away from the real economy and into the financial system. This actually allows us to explain the series of bubbles that arose in the financial system that Alfredo Saad Filho talked about. The bubbles were a consequence of something happening in the real economy, and these bubbles, and underlying them a mega bubble of credit, helped to keep the system driving forwards and helped to give the impression of dynamism and growth in the economy. But the reality is, when each bubble burst, it had to be replaced with an even bigger bubble to keep the system moving forwards. The point I want to make about financialisation is that it hasn't gone away. What we've seen in the last year or so has been a return of the grotesque banking bonuses that we see in the City of London. A return of the financial profits, largely propped up by our money, by state money, but nonetheless financialisation is very much alive and well. And one of the more conspicuous symptoms was the 30% rise in the consumption of luxury champagne in the City of London in the first 3 months of this year. When luxury champagne sales are going up, you know that financialisation is back in the City of London. But that process of financialisation makes any recovery incredibly fragile. Whenever a crisis emerges at one point in the system, it's magnified and it sweeps rapidly through the whole system. As we saw with the shock downturn in the stock market and Wall Street on election night, as we saw with the tremors in Greece, as we saw before Christmas with the problems in Dubai. These problems very, very quickly sweep through the system. The third point I want to make is that it's not certain even the recovery will continue. And we have to understand that the phase we're living through at the moment is shaped by what states did to try and stave off the crisis. State after state intervened in the economy to try and bail out the banking systems, bail out the financial system, and try and keep the whole thing moving forwards. And we did it at the very moment at which their tax revenues were falling and the amount of social spending they were forced to undertake was rising. It creates a context in which the recovery is very, very highly dependent on states continuing to spend. But in continuing to spend, states are ratcheting up the amount of debt that they hold. Public debt is replacing private debt. And so every ruling class around the world faces a dilemma. Do they cut back spending and risk a double-dip recession, or do they keep spending and risk a run on their currency and potential collapse of their financial system? Because of the overall context of the crisis, every option is a bad option. And what we're seeing in Britain in George Osborne's budget, I think, is a desperate attempt to take the first course of risking a double-dip recession to try and cut back public spending to satisfy the bond markets. The final point I want to make really is about what this means for all of us. Because it's very easy to see the viciousness of what they're doing to us and confuse the viciousness with a position of strength. I think we have to understand as well that there are very, very serious divisions at the top of society, and these divisions at the top of society create ideological incoherence and create space for resistance. You can see that at the international level with the arguments of the G8 between the likes of Cameron and Obama, the arguments between Merkel and Sarkozy about what to do about the euro crisis. Everywhere we see the cracks at the top of the system, and we should understand the cracks are a sign of their weakness as well. The ruling class are very, very divided. We'll see more divisions in the British context. You can't today open up the Financial Times without seeing the likes of Martin Wolf attack what George Osborne is doing. And when you get the likes of Martin Wolf, the former High Priest of Globalisation, falling out with the Tory government, you have to understand that there are cracks and divisions there, and as the crisis progresses, there'll be more of them. We have to understand that. What are the consequences for us? Well, we have to say it's not just the objective crisis, it's subjectively what we do about the crisis. And we have to understand that there are two things that we do in this period ahead. The first thing is we have to draw together any sparks of resistance, and we have to give some overall direction and overall political arguments for that resistance. One of the things that George Osborne is voting at the moment, which you should be very aware of, is that he's launching a consultation exercise. And the consultants will go to every community, every workplace, and say, what do you want us to cut? That's a choice that's been posed to us. And we have to have a political alternative where we throw back at them. No, look, we can wipe out the deficit. All you have to do is close the tax loopholes, restore income tax, restore corporation tax, scrap Trident, and there'll be no deficit in this country. We have to begin to provide political arguments, as we're doing for the Right to Work initiative and other initiatives, to begin to draw together resistance and give an alternative. The final thing we have to do is we have to take the opportunity of our ideological coherence to say that we have an explanation and we have solutions. Because the other thing you get when you read the Financial Times is a real sense of fear. And whenever they're scared, it creates opportunities for us. And I want to finish my remarks by quoting for someone I've never quoted before, because he's one of the most obnoxious people writing in the Financial Times. I want to quote from John Kay. John Kay is someone who's clearly terrified, because a few weeks ago he wrote a column with the title "How to Stay Ahead of the Angry Brigade," and the Angry Brigade turns out is us lot. He wrote a quite astonishing column likening the Socialist Workers' Party not just to Al-Qaeda and Hitler, but also to corporate change consultants, even worse. But one of the points that he makes, he writes this, and I'll give him the last word. This group, the Socialist Workers' Party, distinguishes itself from its rivals by insisting revolution is the only acceptable route to the ill-specified change it seeks. And he quotes, "Only through the experience of revolution, the party explains, can the powerless begin to experience their own capacities, test and expand their strengths, and actually become self-consciously capable of running a new world. If this verbiage is familiar," he says, "it probably reminds you of the claims made by corporate change consultants. In the period ahead, we have to be the best fighters, and we have to work with all those who want to fight, but we also have to be the capitalism change consultants."
I just want to turn back to this issue of, again, has the rate of profit fallen? Has it rebounded? This is at the root of this idea of a distinct neoliberal phase that has a distinct crisis that is not an actual crisis of the capitalist system. I think that we have what I call master's words. If you look at the bottom left, that's from Alice in Wonderland, right? But it's the title of the paper, and I think that we have an ethical issue here. What almost everybody means by the rate of profit is profit as a percentage of the amount of capital that was actually invested in the past. But that has not recovered. There's no doubt that hasn't recovered. There's no argument. So the people who say that the rate of profit has recovered, I believe, have an ethical responsibility when engaging in public communication, this is that paper, to avoid saying things that will inevitably be understood as statements that there has been such a recovery. Ideally, they should try to avoid making the term rate of profit mean just what they choose it to mean, neither more nor less, and find a different term for what they now insist upon calling the rate of profit. But if that's somehow too much to ask for, they should at the very least let the public know that what we mean by the rate of profit, which is not what businesses and investors mean or that Marx meant, but is instead the ratio of profit to the replacement cost of capital, that has consistently risen since the 1980s. Definitions of one's variables that are buried in the middle of technical papers are not adequate substitutes for that. I think the public has a right to clear and honest and open communication about these issues.
Thank you. I'm very grateful for the comments that have been made. They've been very stimulating. I think we need a bit of detail in the sense of avoiding or trying to avoid overgeneralization and the use of excessively broad categories. We need a detailed analysis and we need sectoral analysis. If we suggest that there has been long-term stagnation or fall in the rate of profit in contemporary capitalism, then what sectors are you talking about? Are you talking about the auto industry? Are you talking about the steel industry? What industries are you talking about? In which countries are you talking about? And why? Why has that happened? I think it's just not very helpful to talk about an undifferentiated average rate of profit as if it alone could explain the entire dynamics of the world economy in the last 30 years. That's my first point. Second point is that I think we do, as Marxists, we do need to move on from our fixation with the post-war golden age. That was a great period for capitalism, but the fixation with the golden age and measuring everything that happened both before and after the golden age by those standards of Keynesian growth at 4 or 5% a year, that is a fixation of the Keynesians, especially the post-Keynesians. It's not our problem if capitalism is growing at 5% or at 3%. Our problem is to understand the structures of accumulation in the world at that time and now. Next, I think we ought to move on from methodological nationalism. We do have to look at the interaction of the world economy as a whole. We have to see how accumulation takes place in the world. Now, there have been, in the last 30 to 40 years, incredible social, technical, and geographical changes, incredible restructuring of accumulation in capitalism as a whole. Just the Chinese working class alone that has been incorporated into the global economy is larger than the entire working class of all the OECD countries put together. Add to that India, Sub-Saharan Africa, Latin America, Eastern Europe, you have a massive shift in world capitalism. If we're looking specifically at profit rates, that can be a very long discussion about that, but just in the realm of plausibility, if productivity rises in the US manufacturing sector 2% a year since the late 70s until the mid-80s, and salaries are fairly stagnant, there has to be an increase in the rate of surplus value, and that was about 40%. That also helps to explain why the Gini coefficient of concentration of income in the United States rises from 0.4 to 0.47. That's a massive shift in that country alone. I think that is sufficient to raise the possibility that profit rates did not quite tumble in the last few years. And to conclude, to agree with the point that Alex made, I think recovery will be extremely difficult. We're talking about systemic crises for sure. If neoliberalism is able to articulate a recovery, it will be extremely unbalanced, precisely because of the features of neoliberalism that I tried to identify before. Resource control, transnationalization of firms and of the global economy, social control, control over the state and ideology, and control over social reproduction. Keynesianism is impossible because of those reasons, not because the capitalist class doesn't want it. But that is also a call for systemic change. If this is a systemic crisis, we need systemic change. We will not find a solution in the election of alternative governments, as has been tried in several Latin American countries. We will find a solution in the arena of revolutionary mobilization. Thank you.
I've got two quick announcements. First is that Bookmark's bookshop is closing at the Institute at 1, so if you run, you might catch it, but I should have had that announced in earlier sessions. If you really want to get a book, then I would go now and run. The second announcement is that tonight Marxism Festival will be finishing with the Cultures of Resistance gig, Cultures of Resistance and Love Music Hate Racism gig, and that's at the Scala by King's Cross. You can see the map inside the timetable. It's from 7:30 until 8, and the tickets are available but are fastly selling out, so as well, it's great to get a ticket.
I've got 3 minutes, so I'm going to make 3 points. The first point is about Marxist theory, because I think there are a whole number of Marxist theories who I've learned an enormous amount from. 2 of them are on the platform today. We've had also Marxism, Ben Fine, Kostas Lapavitsas, and many others. But I think we should, one of the things that we have to do is we have to create a culture of debate, engagement, in which these people put forward their ideas before theoretically informed and political audiences. There's too much separation in academia between the different Marxists, and one of the things I think we can do quite usefully is begin to bring them together at events like this and see through the exchange of ideas what people think, who's right, and so on and so forth. And I think it's a very, very important thing we do. The second point, the first speaker, I think, raised an important point when he said, well, actually we don't really need to cut the deficit, we should say that. I don't disagree with him. I'm very sympathetic to the notion that bringing the budget down is not the most problematic one in Europe. It's not the one that needs to be smashed. And indeed, what George Osborne is doing is likely to prove disastrous, even in their own terms. That's all true, but I think actually what we have to concentrate on are what political arguments can begin to galvanise and strengthen a mass movement. And my experience was rather different to his. My experience was that when Socialist Worker produced a brilliant spread explaining how we could, in a few strokes, wipe out the budget deficit, that was something that gave people confidence, explained the way forwards, and it combated the idea that there is no alternative to the cuts and we just have to decide what is going to be cut. And I think in the months ahead we're going to need more of that, more arguments about what our alternative is in order to galvanise resistance. Third and final point. The person who said, look, these things happen under capitalism anyway, and why is the crisis important? We have to be absolutely clear that this is not business as usual. Something profound and big is coming our way. When they start talking about 1 million public sector workers being thrown out of work, not only that, but today the announcement that if you're in the civil service, they're going to try and cut your severance pay if they kick you out of work. And actually, I commend Mark Sawatka, who I heard on the radio this morning, the head of the Civil Service Union, saying if they do that, unquestionably there will be strikes. I think we need a bit more of that. But when they talk about 1 million job losses in the public sector, when they talk about 40% cuts to public sector spending, we have to be clear, this is far and away bigger than anything Margaret Thatcher achieved. Not only that, but this is being undertaken by a political elite that is more divided, weaker, more fragmented than existed in Thatcher's day. The coalition is incredibly fragile, and it has very, very little hegemony inside the working class. Some people may resign themselves to voting Tories, but there's very little popular enthusiasm for the Tories on what they're doing. And not only that, as people raise, no one today blames the trade unions and workers for what's going on. No one even blames the oil sheikhs in the Middle East as something they did in the 1970s. Actually, if anything, people blame the bankers. And I have no problem at all, even though I don't think it's just a problem of finance, I have no problem at all beginning from the perspective that we blame the bankers. We don't have a crystal ball and we don't know what's going to happen. We don't know if there's going to be resistance, we don't know what level that resistance is going to be on, and so on. But one thing we should say is that if the upheaval that's coming is as big as we're predicting, and if there is resistance, and we decide out of pessimism to sit on our backsides and do nothing, history will not forgive us. We have to be prepared to go out and fight, and there's 2 things that I think everyone should consider doing. The first is when we go home from Marxism, we have to talk about the Tory conference, because anybody who is anybody hates the Tories and hates the Liberals. That's the point at which the movement can come together, and the Right to Work conference in October outside the Tory conference has to be the next date in our diary. But the final thing we have to talk about is that capitalism as a system is being seen to fail. Not that it's going to collapse overnight, it will take massive resistance to overthrow capitalism, and that's not an immediate prospect. But for those who are convinced that the system has failed, is failing, will continue to fail, we have to say there is a revolutionary alternative, and I would urge people who have not done so to join that revolutionary alternative and join the Socialist Workers' Party.